I remember the day I saw the Wendigo. It was a cold, dark night, and I was out camping with my friends in the woods. We were all huddled around the fire, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. We had heard about the Wendigo before, but we never thought we'd actually see it. As the night wore on, we all started to feel uneasy. It was like something was watching us from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent shivers down our spines. Then, we saw it. It was tall, skeletal, and covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its long, thin arms reached out towards us. We froze, not knowing what to do. The Wendigo let out a bone-chilling scream, and we all ran in different directions. I ran as fast as I could, trying to put as much distance between myself and the Wendigo as possible. I could hear its footsteps pounding behind me, getting closer and closer with each passing second. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, and I knew that I was going to die. Just as I thought it was all over, I saw a bright light in the distance. It was my friend's flashlight. He had come back to look for me. I screamed for him to run, but it was too late. The Wendigo was upon us. I don't know how we survived that night, but we did. We made it back to our campsite, shaken and terrified. We packed up our things and left the woods as quickly as we could. We never went back there again. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. I can still hear the Wendigo's screams and feel its breath on my neck. I don't know what it wanted from us, but I know that it was something terrible. Something that we were lucky to escape from. I've always loved hiking in the woods. There's something about being surrounded by nature that makes me feel alive. So when I heard about a trail that led to a remote lake in the mountains, I knew I had to check it out. I packed my backpack and set out early one morning. The trail was steep and rocky, but I was determined to make it to the lake. As I climbed higher, I noticed that the trees were becoming sparser, and the air was getting colder. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the altitude. When I finally reached the lake, I was awestruck. It was crystal clear and surrounded by snow-capped mountains. I sat down to rest and take in the view. That's when I heard it. It was a faint rustling sound, coming from the forest behind me. I turned around, expecting to see a deer or a squirrel, but instead, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what it was. A Wendigo. I had heard the stories from the locals, warning of the dangers of the mountains. I didn't believe in them, but now I knew better. The Wendigo didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing stronger. It was as if it was drawing energy from the air around us. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to stand up. I was paralyzed with fear. That's when I heard another sound. This one was closer, and it was coming from the lake. I turned around and saw a giant creature emerging from the water. It was a Gigopler, with one eye and razor-sharp teeth. It lumbered towards me, growling and snarling. I was trapped between two monsters, both hungry for my flesh. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my backpack and ran towards the forest, hoping to lose them in the trees. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I could hear their footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck. Finally, I burst out of the trees and into a clearing. I could see the trailhead in the distance, and I sprinted towards it with all my might. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and I didn't look back until I was safely inside. I never went back to that lake again. But sometimes, when I'm hiking in the woods, I can feel their presence watching me. Waiting for me to slip up. Waiting to claim their next victim. I've always been a fan of hiking, and I've been to some pretty remote places, but what happened to me last summer was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. It was a warm July evening, and I had been hiking for most of the day. I was tired and hungry, and I was looking for a place to set up camp for the night. I found a small clearing in the woods that looked like it would be perfect. I set up my tent and started a fire. As I was cooking my dinner, I heard a rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but then I heard something breathing heavily. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. The Gigopler. It was standing about 20 feet away from me, staring right at me with its one piercing eye. It was tall, much taller than a man, with long arms and legs. It looked like it was made of shadows, and its skin was as black as coal. I froze, not sure what to do. The Gigopler took a step towards me, and that's when I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack and ran as fast as I could through the woods. I could hear the Gigopler chasing me, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind me. I didn't look back until I was sure I was far enough away from the clearing. When I finally did, I saw the Gigopler standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I could feel its gaze on me, even from that distance. I made it back to my car and drove straight home. I didn't tell anyone what happened, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real. I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, and I'll never go back to those woods again. I never believed in monsters, at least not until that fateful night. My friends and I had planned a camping trip in the remote woods of northern Canada, where we hoped to get away from the noise of the city and enjoy some peace and quiet. We set up camp near a small lake and spent the first few days exploring the area, fishing, and enjoying the beautiful scenery. But everything changed on the third night. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something rustling outside our tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I heard a strange whispering sound, almost like a voice. I tried to wake up my friends, but they were fast asleep, so I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered outside. What I saw froze me in my tracks. In the darkness, I could barely make out the shape of a tall, thin figure, with glowing eyes and long, sharp claws. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it wasn't human. It was a Wendigo. I had heard stories about Wendigos from the local First Nations people, but I never thought they were real. According to legend, Wendigos were spirits of the forest, hungry and always looking for their next prey. They were said to be incredibly fast and strong, and their hunger could never be satisfied. I knew I had to get back to the safety of the tent, but my legs felt like jelly. The Wendigo seemed to sense my fear and started to move closer, its long, slender fingers reaching out to me. I could feel its breath on my face, and I was sure I was going to be its next meal. But then, something strange happened. The Wendigo suddenly recoiled, as if it had been burned. It let out a blood-curdling scream and darted off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I never told my friends what had happened that night, but I knew what I had seen. The Wendigo was real, and it was out there, hungry and waiting for its next victim. I made sure to never venture out into the woods at night again, and I always kept a sharp eye out for any signs of the Wendigo's presence. It was a terrifying experience that I will never forget, and it's one that I hope I never have to relive again. I grew up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, where legends and myths were a part of everyday life. Stories of Wendigos had always intrigued me, but I never thought I'd actually encounter one. It was a typical winter night, and I was walking back home after hanging out with some friends. As I walked, I heard a strange noise in the distance. It was a low growl, almost like an animal, but somehow different. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but my heart started racing as the noise grew louder. Suddenly, I saw a figure emerge from the trees ahead of me. It was tall and thin, with long limbs and matted hair. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its bones. The creature had antlers sprouting from its head, and its fingers ended in sharp claws. I froze in terror as the Wendigo stared at me, its growls turning into an unearthly shriek. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, and I knew that I was in danger. Without thinking, I turned and ran as fast as I could, praying that I could make it home safely. As I ran, I could hear the Wendigo's footsteps getting closer and closer. It was gaining on me, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it caught up. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning and my legs aching, but I refused to give up. Finally, I burst through the door of my house and slammed it shut behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air and shaking with fear. For hours, I lay there, too afraid to move or even breathe. I didn't know if the Wendigo was still outside, waiting for me, or if it had gone back into the woods. In the morning, I gathered my courage and ventured outside. There was no sign of the Wendigo, but I could feel its presence lingering in the air. From that night on, I never ventured into the woods alone again, and I always made sure to keep a watchful eye on the darkness that surrounded me. I never believed in monsters until I saw a Gigopler with my own two eyes. It was a few summers ago, and I was camping with some friends deep in the woods. We were miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. It was peaceful, in a way, but also a little unnerving. I'd never been so far away from the safety of the city before. On the second night of our trip, I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of my tent, trying not to wake anyone else up. As I was making my way through the trees, I heard something rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other harmless animal, but then I heard a low growl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep and menacing, like it came from something much larger than a deer. My heart racing, I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise. That's when I saw it, a massive, hulking figure with one glowing red eye. Its skin was dark and scaly, like a reptile's, and its arms were long and spindly. I froze in terror, unable to move or even scream. The Gigopler stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its eye piercing through the darkness. I could feel it sizing me up, deciding whether or not to attack. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned and ran off into the woods. I stumbled back to my tent, shaking and sweating. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and I barely spoke to my friends the next day. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Gigopler was still out there, watching us, waiting for its chance to strike. When we finally packed up and left the campsite, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about that night. I know that most people wouldn't believe my story, but I know what I saw. And I never want to see it again. I've always been a lover of the great outdoors. Hiking, camping, and exploring the wilderness have been my passion since I was a kid. I've seen my fair share of wildlife, both big and small, and I always thought I knew what to expect out there. But one experience changed everything for me. It was a crisp fall day, and the leaves had just started to change colors. I had planned a solo camping trip to a remote part of the forest that I had never been to before. I was excited to spend some time in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked myself a nice dinner. I watched the stars for a while before crawling into my sleeping bag for the night. But as I started to drift off, I heard something outside. It was a strange noise, like a low growl mixed with a howl. At first, I tried to brush it off as just an animal passing by. But the noise persisted, getting louder and closer. I started to panic, thinking maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. What I saw outside was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was a creature with a human-like body, but it was covered in matted fur, and its face was twisted into a grotesque snarl. Its eyes were glowing a bright red, and its long, bony fingers ended in sharp claws. I froze, not knowing what to do. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, and I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and crawled back into my tent. I could hear the creature pacing outside, its claws scraping against the ground. I stayed in my tent until morning, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I peeked out of my tent, and the creature was nowhere to be seen. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could and hiked back to my car. I've never told anyone about what I saw that night, but I've done some research, and I think it was a Wendigo. They're said to be creatures that prey on humans, using their supernatural powers to lure them into the woods. I don't know if I was lucky to make it out alive, or if the creature decided to spare me for some reason. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never go back to that part of the forest again. I had always heard the stories of the Wendigo from my elders, but I never truly believed in them. That was until I went on a camping trip with my friends in the remote woods of Canada. It was the dead of winter, and the snow was deep. We had set up camp in a clearing, surrounded by dense trees. As we sat around the fire, telling ghost stories, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. That feeling only intensified as the night wore on. We heard strange noises coming from the woods, like something was moving through the trees. We tried to brush it off as just the wind, but deep down, we all knew it was something more. As the fire began to die down, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I could hear branches snapping and the crunching of snow underfoot. I clutched my blanket tightly, trying to ignore the fear that was creeping up inside me. That's when I heard it. A low growl, like something out of a nightmare. My heart raced as I listened to the sound grow louder and closer. Suddenly, the fabric of my tent was ripped open, and I was face to face with the most terrifying creature I had ever seen. It was a Wendigo, with matted fur and glowing eyes. Its breath was hot and rank, and I could smell the stench of death on it. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or even scream. But then, something strange happened. The creature let out a mournful howl, and its form began to shimmer and shift. It morphed into the shape of a woman, dressed in tattered clothes. She looked at me with sad eyes before disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when morning came, I packed up my things and left the woods. I never spoke of what I had seen to my friends, and I never went back to that place again. But the memory of the Wendigo stayed with me, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in the darkness. I I I grew up in a small town in the southwest, where stories about skinwalkers were a common occurrence. My parents always warned me to stay inside after dark and to never go out alone. I never really took those warnings seriously until I had my own encounter with one. It was a warm summer night, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The road was deserted, and the only sounds were the crickets chirping in the distance. As I was driving, I noticed a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a person walking along the side of the road, but as I got closer, I realized that it was something else entirely. The figure was tall and slender, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch out into the darkness. Its eyes glowed in the moonlight, and its skin was a sickly shade of gray. As I got closer, I could see that its face was contorted into a grotesque snarl, and I could hear its low growl even with the windows rolled up. I knew then that I was face to face with a skinwalker. My heart pounding in my chest, I stepped on the gas and tried to speed away, but the creature was faster. It began to chase after me, its limbs moving in a blur as it closed in on my car. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck as it slammed into the rear of my car, shaking it violently. I knew that if I didn't do something fast, I would be its next victim. Thinking quickly, I reached into my glove compartment and grabbed the can of mace I kept there for emergencies. I rolled down the window and sprayed the creature in the face, hoping to buy myself some time. It let out a blood-curdling scream and stumbled back, giving me the chance to speed away. I didn't stop until I was safely back at my house, where I locked all the doors and windows and waited for daylight to come. When I finally got the courage to leave my house, I found claw marks on the rear of my car and scratches on the pavement where the creature had chased me. I never saw the skinwalker again, but the memory of that encounter still haunts me to this day. I know now that the stories I heard as a child were not just folklore, but real-life dangers that I should have taken more seriously. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I was on a camping trip with my friends in the deep woods of Canada, near the border of Alaska. We had set up our tents near a small lake and had a great time fishing and exploring during the day. But at night, everything changed. On the second night of our trip, we were sitting around a campfire, telling scary stories and roasting marshmallows. It was getting late, and we were all starting to get tired. I suggested we go to bed, and everyone agreed. We each retreated to our own tents and settled in for the night. I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard something outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just a branch or a small animal, but the sound continued, and it was getting closer. I started to feel a sense of unease, and my heart began to race. Then, I heard it, a low growling sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out to my friends? Should I try to scare off whatever was outside my tent? I lay there frozen, listening to the growling getting louder and closer. That's when I saw it. It was a figure, tall and thin, with antlers on its head. It had long, bony arms and legs, and its skin was gray and rotting. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and it was staring straight at me. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move or speak. The creature started to circle my tent, and I could hear it breathing heavily. Its breath was hot and moist, and it smelled like death. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the creature through the thin fabric of my tent. Eventually, it moved away, disappearing into the darkness. I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move or make a sound. When morning came, I emerged from my tent, shaken and pale. My friends noticed immediately and asked me what was wrong. I didn't want to tell them what had happened, afraid they would think I was crazy or making it up. But I couldn't keep it inside any longer, so I told them everything. To my surprise, one of my friends had heard something outside his tent as well. He described a similar creature, with the same glowing eyes and rotting skin. We all agreed that we needed to leave the woods immediately. We packed up our gear and left the campsite as quickly as we could. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we reported our sighting to the authorities. They listened to our story but didn't seem to take us seriously. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. But I know it was real, and it still haunts me. I've heard stories of a creature called the Wendigo, said to live in the deep woods of Canada and Alaska. I don't know if that's what we saw, but I know I never want to encounter it again.